Homage to the Triple Gem. And this is Bante Joe here, and I'm just here at Bataramula. Come down to the Colombo area to apply for an Australian visa. So it actually looks like we'll be going to Australia and doing some Dhamma programs there, which I'm looking forward to. And so we had a meditation meeting not long ago, and there was a good question in the meeting, which was basically using the framework of the Four Noble Truths. How do we apply that in everyday life? Basically, how do we apply the Four Noble Truths? How does that framework apply to our practice? So, the Four Noble Truths, they are truths that also carry duties with them. So in other words, they're not just meant to be a kind of ontological truth, like a truth about reality or the way that things really are. They're meant to be a set of truths that lead one onwards to realize something. And you can say, realize the truth. So, one of the important aspects of the Four Noble Truths is these duties. The first Noble Truth is the truth of suffering. And the duty with regards to suffering is it should be understood. And the second Noble Truth is the truth of the cause of suffering. And the duty with the cause of suffering is that it should be abandoned. And the third Noble Truth is the cessation of suffering, which is to be realized. And the fourth Noble Truth is the path leading to the cessation of suffering, which is to be developed. So, oftentimes we think of this as like an intellectual framework, kind of how does this map directly onto our practice? And of course, one of the most obvious ways would be, say, like the Noble Eightfold Path, but even that has its kind of whorls, its connections in it. So one way to look at, to approach that matter is to look at the Four Noble Truths as describing the process by which we cause ourselves to suffer. It's a process of addiction. We're addicted to things. It's these addictions that cause us to suffer. So, when we want to understand suffering, that's the duty of the first Noble Truth. Of course, there's an intellectual component to this. If a person doesn't know that they're addicted to something, they don't know that the thing that they're addicted to is bad, even on an intellectual level, it's almost certain that they're not going to be putting forth any effort to overcome whatever their addiction is. This kind of intellectual understanding is really important, but it's not the type of understanding necessarily that the Buddha is talking about when he talks about the duty of suffering is to understand it. One of the interesting things with a person's suffering is that when people experience suffering, they don't usually want to be there for the experience of suffering. This is actually where addictions form. When a person is experiencing suffering, say, and they want to distract themselves from their suffering by eating food. This is where a food addiction forms. Or they want to distract themselves by taking drugs. This is where a drug addiction forms, or one of the ways that drug addictions can form. It's when consuming a particular external substance or consuming something external to one, in the broader way that the word consuming could be used, in order to distract oneself from internal pain. This is one of the ways that a person can get addicted to whatever it might be outside. So understanding suffering also has this component of being able to not distract oneself in the face of suffering. And it's at times that one doesn't distract oneself in the face of suffering that one can really get to know what the suffering is, where it's coming from, and really what's causing it. So this is one of the things about distracting oneself from suffering, is that the distraction gives a kind of temporary relief, but the suffering builds up in the background. It builds up in the background because it amplifies the causes of suffering to a certain extent. It's kind of, one is trying to distract oneself by eating food, kind of eating a lot of food. The immediate sensory stimulus distracts one from whatever pain one has. But it amplifies the causes of suffering because the mind works on a process of habituation. So actually one's ability to tolerate the suffering in the future gets less, because one has distracted oneself rather than facing the suffering. So one is actually training the mind to become more sensitive to the arising of whatever that type of suffering is, and to become more inclined towards distraction. So in other words, that perception of suffering that comes in one's mind, the next time, whatever it might be, kind of worry about work, or anger that somebody said something to him, whatever the main cause of suffering is for a person, the cause that is making one run to the fridge or run to the movies, whatever it might be, the perception of that suffering in one's mind gets amplified if one goes out and tries to distract oneself. Another reason is that one is putting causes into place now that will ripen in pain in the future. And obviously that can be a vicious cycle that just causes one to run back and look for more means of distraction. If one is going out and forming a food addiction because of something that one wants to distract oneself from, then obviously that food addiction will cause compound problems in the future. It's going to lead to more problems in the future. So when we want to understand suffering, what it means is that when this pain, whatever it might be, the pain is that comes up in a person's mind, is not to run away from it, but to be able to be with the pain and investigate it in such a way that one can see for oneself what the cause is, what it is that's causing this pain. And this is always something, the cause of pain that we can learn to control is always something that we're doing. It's always something that a person is actually doing to cause the pain. The tricky thing is that oftentimes people don't want to see what they're doing, because the reality of it is it connects back to something that people like. All the suffering that a person has is connected to things that they like, most of the time. So the next one, in terms of the cause of suffering, this is actually, these things kind of get glommed together, kind of the cause of suffering being craving. One wants to be able to see where this kind of craving that one has is. It's not always apparent. Kind of, as I mentioned, the suffering that one experiences is tied. So it's almost always tied to something that one likes, something that one is afraid of losing. This is where suffering comes from, and that suffering comes from this craving, this kind of desire for this external pleasure, or even an internal pleasure, desire to consume a pleasure and to be sustained by that. So they have this link, independent origination, which goes contact, feeling, craving, clinging, becoming. In other words, one feels a feeling, one is contacted by something, there's a contact. This is where feeling comes from, by the way. And based on these feelings, one craves, one either wants it, one doesn't want it, whatever it might be. And based on that craving, one clings to something, and develops an identity around that. This is where we get our perceptions about who we are, as what type of person I am, and what types of things I can add, I am the owner of. That's how a person builds up their perception of what they are. I'm a person who has this many kids, I've got this house, I had this job, I've got this face. This is how a person builds their identity. And it's based on this kind of craving. So in order to abandon this craving, to realize the cessation of suffering on both large and small scales, it requires combating this addiction. It requires withdrawing one's mind, resisting the temptation to go out and consume whatever it is that one is consuming, both on the gross level, whether it's like an addiction like food or drugs, or on the subtle level, whether it's kind of the building of an identity. So this resistance, again, it's always kind of built up through learning to undermine the addictions that we have, the bad habits that we have, our negative qualities, and build up the good ones. And this is where we really are able to abandon the causes of suffering, because it's something internal that's making us suffer. So the third one is a cessation of suffering, which is to be realized. And this kind of realization of the cessation of suffering, all these things can get glommed together in reality. It's one often realizes the cessation of suffering. You can say, at the same time, there's actually an understanding of the suffering. So I remember when I was young, I think I've told this story in different different forums before, different times before. But I used to be addicted to marijuana, and I went through this year where I would struggle, kind of, smoking marijuana, then trying to quit, then smoking marijuana, then trying to quit, then smoking marijuana, trying to quit. It kind of went on for a year. It was this immense battle because the smoking of marijuana wasn't just the addiction to the thing. There was a lifestyle that was built around that. And you get friends built around that. You get your whole mode of going through the world can revolve around this kind of smoking of marijuana. And the identities that one builds up for oneself. So it was this big fight, and a fight that was lifestyle changing. But at the end, it came to this point where I just decided, I'm sick of relapsing. I'm just going to start sprinting down the hill every day and sprinting back up. Because one of the things that I really missed was being able to sprint, being able to do athletics. It's kind of, that's not so easy to do when you have a smoking habit. So there was this time that I smoked marijuana. I relapsed and I sprinted down. I still decided I was going to sprint down this hill. So I sprinted all the way down the hill, sprinted all the way back up. And I got sick. Got this kind of like lung infection. It lasted for a while. And after that lung infection, this kind of realization came. It's kind of, that's what happens from smoking marijuana. Marijuana makes you sick. Of course, the intellectual aspect of that is something really easy to understand. But the aspect of it that comes up in a person's mind when they really can see it, it often goes hand in hand with actually the defeat of that addiction. So after that, my addiction to marijuana more or less lost its power. And I think I only smoked marijuana once more, but never again. So the cessation of suffering, which is to be realized, is something, again, that's realized through the overcoming of our craving, the overcoming of our addictions. Now the last one, the path to the cessation of suffering. This path to the cessation of suffering, one of the really important things that we can take away from it is that in fighting our addictions, in fighting the things that a person likes to do, that likes to build identities around, that one craves for, either to keep or to get rid of, in fighting these things, and taking on identities around these things, it's not just a one-trick pony process that one can defeat the addiction. One has to get really creative because these things branch out into so many aspects of a person's life. Just this example of an addiction to marijuana is one. What about the addiction to an identity? What about the addiction to the belief in a permanent soul? These things branch out into everything almost that makes it worthwhile for a person to live life. Not in the sense of leading to suicide, but the reason one keeps coming back to be reborn is because one sees life as worthwhile. Well, life and death are the same thing. You don't get one without the other. So, in order to overcome these addictions, one needs to use a variety of tools. And this Noble Eightfold Path is a path of development. It's also tools. Categories in which one can develop tools in order to overcome the addictions that one has that cause one to keep coming back, cause one to keep getting reborn and to keep suffering. Now, you have to develop in right view, all the way down the line, right mindfulness and right concentration, livelihood, your intentions, your actions, all these things figure in to the way in which a person lives their life and the way in which they go out and acquire the things that they're addicted to. So essentially the Buddhist strategy in the Noble Eightfold Path, it's a strategy of almost, you might say, one can almost say like a replacement strategy. Because so long as one is addicted to things outside, one is totally reliant on them, one can't see a type of happiness that lies beyond those addictions. So if one wants to let go of the lesser happiness, one has to try to develop higher ones first, or should try to develop higher ones first. It's a good strategy. So that is one of the ways that one can learn to let go of these addictions. One can learn to develop the path, is to learn to take happiness, learn to take on states of becoming that are more and more under one's control. If one can do this, then the loss of things that are less and less under one's control, external things, becomes less and less threatening. And one can investigate these things in this way. There's the classic formula of sila, samadhi, and panya. But it doesn't always have to be that way. There's some people who develop panya, then samadhi, although one always wants to be keeping sila. So this right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right effort, right livelihood, right mindfulness, and right concentration, all these categories of action, categories of skillful behaviors to be developed, there's so many different ways that one can develop them. And one has to develop them in an appropriate way, to develop an appropriate remedy for the addictions that plague one's mind, and for the things that one likes to do but cannot stop oneself from doing. So it's good to view these addictions almost like they're living opponents. And it's like being in a boxing match with somebody who's alive and is observing your movement, same time you're observing them. So all these qualities, these are categories in the Noble Eightfold Path. One can view these categories as like an overarching framework under which one can develop the skills to beat one's addictions. So one can see this in the small ways, the way that these Four Noble Truths operate, the truth of suffering, the truth of the cause of suffering, the truth of the cessation of suffering, and the truth of the path leading to the cessation of suffering. One can see these in the small ways one overcomes one's suffering in one's practice. And these small ways lead up to the larger ways. So in every aspect of the Buddhist training, in every aspect of one's application of the Four Noble Truths, it's good. It's a good thing. And all of the Buddha's teachings fit under this framework of the Four Noble Truths. Everything that we practice fits into here, fits into our quest to eliminate craving on both the small and large levels. Because it's this craving that causes a person to suffer, running here and there seeking ever fresh delight, running after a feeling, running after a perception, creating an identity around that. It leads to birth, and it's the same thing as death. So for those who want to abandon suffering, also have to abandon life, also have to abandon death, also have to abandon birth. And it's this Noble Eightfold Path that leads there. It's these Four Noble Truths that describe how to end suffering. So suffering is to be comprehended, its cause is to be abandoned, its cessation is to be realized, and the path to its cessation is to be developed. This is the framework that teaches us how to end suffering. Okay, so I think leave that for reflection, and wishing everybody all the blessings of Dhamma practice.